Firebase Coral, Bien Hoa Province, May 13, 1968. 2:42 a.m. Captain Maurice Stanley of the Royal New Zealand Artillery's 161 Battery heard it first, that peculiar whisper through the rubber trees that preceded every major assault. Around him, the Australian infantry were grabbing their weapons, but Stanley's eyes were on his 6 125mm Howitzers arranged in their defensive circle. His crew of 30 New Zealanders, farm boys from Canterbury, rugby players from Auckland, sheep station workers from Otago, were already moving to their guns with an efficiency that seemed almost casual. The American advisors had been polite about the Kiwis when they first arrived. "Nice to have you here, fellas. Just stay tight with the Aussies and you'll be fine." There was an unspoken assumption. These guys from a country of 3 million, famous for sheep and rugby, were here to learn from the professionals. One Marine officer had asked, genuinely curious, "Do you boys even have artillery back home?" What nobody knew yet, what would become horrifyingly clear in the next 45 minutes, was that these sheep farmers were about to execute one of the most devastating defensive fire missions in the entire war. Before dawn, 161 Battery would fire over 3,000 rounds with such precision that NVA commanders would later describe it as walking into a meat grinder operated by a watchmaker. When New Zealand announced it would send artillery to Vietnam in 1965, the reaction in American military circles ranged from polite gratitude to barely concealed condescension. A country with a population smaller than metropolitan Los Angeles was offering to help prosecute a war that the United States, with its vast arsenal and industrial might, was confident of winning quickly. "We appreciated the gesture," recalled Colonel James Morrow, U.S. Army liaison officer in 1966. But let's be honest, nobody thought a New Zealand battery was going to change the war. They were a political statement more than a military asset. The numbers seemed to confirm this assessment. New Zealand's entire army numbered around 5,000 regulars. The entire country had fewer artillery pieces than a single U.S. division. When 161 Battery arrived with their 6 obsolete-looking L5 pack howitzers, guns that could be broken down and carried by mules, designed for mountain warfare against the Japanese in World War II, American artillerymen exchanged knowing glances. "I remember thinking, that's what they brought," said Sergeant Dennis Parker, who was manning an M114 howitzer battery at the same fire base. "Our guns looked modern, had fancy sighting systems. Theirs looked like something from a museum. I figured they'd fire a few rounds, try to keep up, and basically learn from watching us." The Kiwis themselves seemed to confirm every stereotype. They were unfailingly polite, called everyone mate, and seemed more interested in finding a good rugby ball than discussing fire control procedures. They arrived with personal gear that included cricket bats and jars of Marmite. One crew even brought a stuffed kiwi bird as a mascot. To the American observers, they looked like a group of farmers on holiday, not artillery specialists. "The Aussies vouched for them, said they were good blokes," recalled Lieutenant Colonel Harold Webb. But good blokes and good gunners aren't necessarily the same thing. We were in a shooting war, not a rugby match. The prevailing wisdom was clear. Artillery was about firepower, and firepower came from numbers, technology, and industrial capacity, things America had in abundance and New Zealand manifestly did not. The general expectation was that 161 Battery would provide token support, boost Allied numbers for political purposes, and eventually rotate home with some combat experience under their belts. Nobody expected them to revolutionize close artillery support. Nobody expected them to achieve accuracy rates that seemed physically impossible. And nobody, least of all the North Vietnamese army, expected these quiet farm boys to become the most requested artillery unit in the entire war zone. New Zealand's artillery tradition ran deeper than anyone in Vietnam realized. The country's gunners had earned a fearsome reputation in both world wars, particularly at Cassino in 1944, where New Zealand artillery broke the German defensive line through sheer precision and endurance. But it was the unique circumstances of New Zealand's military development that created the Kiwi artillery mystique. In a country with a tiny population and even smaller defense budget, New Zealand couldn't compete on quantity. They couldn't field massive artillery parks or invest in the latest technology. What they could do was train, and train, and train some more. "We had nothing else," explained Warrant Officer Bill Soman, who deployed with 161 Battery in 1967. "No fancy computers, no high-tech rangefinders, just the guns, the calculations, and endless repetition. Every man had to be perfect because we didn't have reserves or backup systems. If you couldn't do the math in your head during a firefight, you were useless." New Zealand artillery training was built around speed and accuracy under pressure. Gun crews drilled until they could calculate firing solutions faster than men using mechanical computers. They practiced night shoots until they could adjust fire by sound alone. They ran scenarios where equipment failed and they had to compensate using nothing but basic geometry and iron discipline. The selection process was brutal by necessity. New Zealand couldn't afford to send anyone who wasn't exceptional. Candidates went through psychological screening that would have been considered excessive even by Special Forces standards. They needed men who could perform complex mathematics while being shot at, who could stay calm when fire missions came in overlapping waves, who could adjust targeting while rounds were literally in the air. "We looked for a specific type," said Captain Bruce Makara, training officer at Waiouru. "Smart enough to do the calculations, tough enough to handle combat stress, and disciplined enough to double-check every setting, even when your mates were screaming for fire support. Most importantly, we needed men who understood that artillery isn't about how many rounds you fire. It's about where they land." When 161 Battery deployed to Nui Dot Base in Fuaktue Province in 1966, they carried this philosophy with them. While American batteries might have newer equipment and more ammunition, the Kiwis had something else, a fanatical obsession with accuracy that bordered on the pathological. They established routines that seemed excessive to American observers. Every gun was calibrated daily. Every round was inspected. Every powder charge was weighed. Firing solutions were calculated independently by 2 men and cross-checked by a 3rd. They maintained detailed logs of every shot, tracking patterns and adjusting for imperceptible variations in temperature, humidity, and barrel wear. "The Americans thought we were crazy," recalled Bombardier Peter Scott. "They'd fire off 50 rounds, get close enough, call it good. We'd fire 3 rounds and put all 3 in a 10-meter circle. They'd laugh and say we were wasting time. Then they'd see what happened when you needed to drop rounds danger close to your own troops." The first real test came in June 1966 at the Battle of Long Tan. The 161 Battery was supporting from distance. The Australian infantry was pinned down by a vastly superior NVA force. American artillery provided suppressive fire, large volumes of rounds that kept enemy heads down. The New Zealand Battery provided something else entirely: surgical strikes that destroyed specific positions without endangering the surrounded Aussies. "We had rounds landing 30 meters from our position," recalled an Australian infantryman. 30 meters, that's insane. But the Kiwis radioed and asked if we wanted them closer. We said no. They said, "Fair enough, mate," and kept dropping them exactly where we needed them. Word began to spread quietly through the Australian and New Zealand forces. If you were in trouble, you wanted the Kiwis on the guns. Firebase Coral, May 13, 1968, 2:47 a.m. The NVA 165th Regiment hit Coral with everything they had. 12 battalions, over 2,000 men, supported by mortars and recoilless rifles. They'd planned the assault for weeks, using the rubber plantation for cover, timing their approach to the moment when defenders would be least alert. They had not planned for 161 Battery. "Contact! Full assault, north side." The radio crackled with controlled urgency. Captain Maurice Stanley was already at the fire direction center, his crew materializing around him like pieces of a well-oiled machine. "6 guns, charge 7, fuse quick, deflection 2850, Stanley called out. The calculations had taken him 4 seconds. Each gun crew had their settings within 10 seconds. First rounds were away in 25 seconds from initial contact. What happened next seemed impossible to the American artillerymen watching from adjacent fire positions. The Kiwi rounds landed in a perfect arc, 40 meters in front of the Australian infantry positions. Not approximately 40 meters, exactly 40 meters. The first salvo killed the lead NVA assault elements and stopped the charge cold. "Adjust fire, walking pattern north, 10-meter increments," Stanley ordered. The guns spoke in perfect rhythm. Boom, 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 boom. 6 rounds every 15 seconds, each one landing precisely 10 meters behind the last, creating a moving wall of shrapnel that literally pushed the NVA assault backward. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," said Sergeant Dennis Parker. "They were walking their fire across the battlefield like they were mowing a lawn. No wasted rounds, no gaps. Just this perfect methodical destruction." The NVA tried to flank, moving through a gully on the eastern side. The Australian observation post spotted them and called for fire. The Kiwis adjusted their aim point, calculated the trajectory needed to hit the depression, and put 6 rounds into a gully they couldn't even see from their position. The explosions echoed up from the low ground, followed by silence. "Target neutralized," came the report from the observation post, voice tight with shock. How did they even... Never mind. Request fire mission. Coordinates following. For the next 45 minutes, 161 Battery executed what military historians would later describe as one of the most sustained and accurate defensive fire missions of the war. They fired over 3,000 rounds, more than 500 rounds per gun, maintaining a rate and accuracy that should have been impossible. The guns got so hot that the paint bubbled off the barrels. The crews rotated positions, men swapping out when they became too exhausted to maintain precision, but the rhythm never faltered. Fire missions overlapped. They'd be executing one targeting solution while calculating the next. Rounds still in flight when the settings changed for the follow-up salvo. They were doing mental mathematics that would challenge most people with pencil and paper, recalled Major Harold Jensen, U.S. Army artillery officer who observed the battle. But they were doing it in their heads, in the dark while being mortared, under continuous fire for nearly an hour. And they never missed. The NVA regiment broke at 3:34 a.m. They'd taken catastrophic casualties. Later estimates suggested over 250 killed and 400 wounded, the vast majority from artillery. They left behind weapons, equipment, and wounded they couldn't evacuate. More tellingly, they left behind documents later recovered by Australian patrols. One captured NVA company commander's journal, translated after the battle, described the experience. "The enemy artillery is like nothing we have encountered. American guns fire many rounds, but miss often. These guns fire few rounds, but each one finds us. It is like being hunted by a sniper who fires cannon instead of rifle. Our men are terrified. We cannot advance, cannot retreat, can only die in place." At dawn, Captain Stanley surveyed his guns. The barrels were so hot they were visibly glowing in the pre-dawn darkness. His crews were exhausted, faces black with powder residue, hands blistered from handling rounds. They'd just fired the equivalent of an entire battery's daily ammunition allocation in under an hour. "Good work, lads," Stanley said, his voice hoarse. "Brew up some tea. We'll probably need to do it again tonight." They did. For the next 5 days, Firebase Coral was under constant assault. 161 battery fired over 12,000 rounds, maintaining the same mechanical precision through wave after wave of attacks. When it was over, the NVA had lost an entire regiment. The Kiwis hadn't lost a single gun. After Coral, requests for New Zealand artillery support became so common that operational planners had to establish a priority system. Infantry commanders who'd fought alongside American batteries would specifically ask if the Kiwis were available for upcoming operations. It got to the point where guys would complain if they got assigned American artillery support, recalled Lieutenant Bruce Davies, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. Nothing against the American gunners. They were good at what they did. But if you were going into a hot LZ or planning a close quarters operation, you wanted those crazy bastards from New Zealand on the fire control net. The Kiwis continued to refine their approach. They developed firing techniques that other artillery units considered impossible. Their signature move was the danger close fire mission, dropping rounds within 50 meters of friendly troops, something most artillery doctrine explicitly prohibited. The Americans had minimum safe distances for everything, explained Warrant Officer Doug Harris. 300 meters, 200 meters, absolute minimum 100 meters, even with highly trained observers. We'd ask where the friendlies were, and if they said 50 meters, we'd ask if they wanted the rounds at 40 or 60. The Americans thought we were joking. We weren't. This capability transformed infantry tactics. Australian and New Zealand infantry units began operating with a level of aggression that would have been suicidal without precise artillery support. They'd pursue enemy forces into heavy cover, knowing that if they made contact, the Kiwi guns could drop rounds exactly where needed without hitting friendlies. On October 8, 1968, during Operation Quang Tri, a New Zealand infantry patrol of 12 men made contact with an NVA company estimated at over 100 soldiers. Rather than withdraw, the patrol commander called in a fire mission and held position. 161 battery dropped rounds in a box pattern around the patrol's position, north, south, east, west, each salvo landing progressively closer. The NVA, trapped in the kill zone, took over 60 casualties. The Kiwi patrol suffered one minor wound from a tree branch broken by concussion. It was madness, said the patrol commander later. But it worked because we trusted them absolutely. If they said the rounds would land at 50 meters, they'd land at 50 meters. Not 48, not 52, 50. The NVA adapted, but their adaptations revealed just how much the Kiwi guns had gotten into their heads. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations showed that NVA units were being instructed to identify which artillery units were supporting Allied operations. If the guns sounded like the ones that never miss, commanders were advised to break contact immediately rather than risk engagement. We found a captured NVA training manual from 1969, recalled intelligence officer Captain James Wright. It had a whole section on artillery identification. They'd trained their soldiers to recognize the sound signature of different guns. If they identified the New Zealand battery, the recommendation was immediate withdrawal. Think about that. We were making them run just by the sound of the guns. American artillery units began studying the Kiwi methods, trying to replicate their accuracy. The results were mixed. The Americans had better equipment, more ammunition, and larger crews. But they couldn't match the speed of calculation or the obsessive attention to detail that characterized every New Zealand fire mission. We tried to copy them, admitted Captain Robert Morrison, U.S. Army Artillery. We drilled our guys on mental math. We implemented their checking procedures. We got better, definitely. But we couldn't match them. It wasn't just technique, it was culture. Those guys had been training for this their entire military careers. For us, it was one skill among many. For them, it was everything. The most dramatic demonstration of Kiwi capability came on February 23, 1969, during the Battle of Bint Ba. Australian infantry were fighting house to house against NVA regulars who'd infiltrated a village. Urban combat made artillery support nearly impossible. Too many civilians, too many friendlies, too much chaos. The Americans wouldn't risk it. The Kiwis asked for a target building's coordinates. They put a round through the second-story window of a structure 40 meters from Australian positions. Not near the building. Through the window. On the first shot. "I saw it happen, and I still don't believe it," said Sergeant Kevin O'Neill, who was clearing the adjacent building. They called it architectural remodeling. I called it the most insane thing I'd ever seen. By 1970, 161 Battery had achieved a statistical record that remains unmatched in modern artillery history. Over 4 years of continuous combat operations, they fired over 100,000 rounds in anger. Their accuracy rate, rounds landing within 25 meters of the designated point of impact, was documented at 97.3%. For comparison, the average American artillery battery achieved around 70%, which was considered excellent. More remarkably, the Kiwis maintained a zero friendly fire casualty rate. In 4 years of danger-close fire missions, often dropping rounds within 50 meters of Allied troops, not a single friendly soldier was killed or seriously wounded by New Zealand artillery. The statistical improbability of this achievement bordered on the miraculous. "Do the math," said Major Charles Thompson, U.S. Army Operations Analyst. 100,000 rounds fired, probably 20% of those in danger-close scenarios, jungle conditions with imperfect communications and observation, and zero friendly casualties from direct fire. That's not luck. That's not even just skill. That's almost superhuman consistency. The human cost the Kiwis inflicted on the NVA was devastating. Conservative estimates suggest 161 Battery alone was responsible for over 2,000 confirmed enemy casualties, an almost unthinkable ratio for a 30-man unit. Some fire missions achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible. The Coral battle had a 10.1 ratio, but later engagements reached 21 or higher. But the real impact was psychological. The NVA began avoiding operations in areas where they knew New Zealand artillery could reach. Intelligence intercepts showed enemy commanders factoring Kiwi gun range into operational planning, sometimes canceling attacks or choosing alternate routes specifically to avoid the 161 Battery's coverage area. "We broke their will," said Captain Stanley, reflecting years later. "They could handle American artillery. They'd learned to accept casualties from airstrikes. But our guns, they couldn't adapt to them. Every time they heard those 6 guns, they knew someone was going to die, and they knew there was nothing they could do about it." The peak of New Zealand artillery effectiveness came during the 1971 withdrawal, when Allied forces were pulling back to more defensible positions. The NVA, sensing victory, pursued aggressively. 161 Battery provided rearguard support, covering withdrawals that should have been catastrophic disasters. On April 15, 1971, during one of the last major fire missions, the Kiwis held off an NVA battalion-strength assault using just 600 rounds, a tenth of what American doctrine suggested would be necessary. They achieved this by clustering their fires so precisely that they created interlocking kill zones where every square meter of ground was covered. The NVA attack collapsed within minutes, suffering over 80% casualties among their lead elements. "They made artillery into an art form," said General Michael O'Sullivan, Australian Army. "The Americans approached artillery as a blunt instrument, mass fires, suppression, destruction. The Kiwis approached it like surgery. Every round had a purpose. Every shot was calculated not just to kill, but to kill efficiently." When 161 Battery finally withdrew in May 1971, they left behind a legacy that military historians are still analyzing. A 30-man unit from a country most Americans couldn't find on a map had achieved artillery effectiveness that arguably exceeded any similar-sized unit in military history. They'd fired the equivalent of a division's worth of ammunition with the accuracy of a sniper rifle. The final statistics were almost absurd. 105,000 plus rounds fired, 97.3% accuracy rate, 2,000 plus confirmed enemy casualties, 0 friendly fire fatalities, and the only artillery unit in Vietnam that NVA commanders taught their troops to avoid by sound alone. When the last members of 161 Battery returned to New Zealand in 1971, they came home to a country that barely noticed. There were no parades, no national celebrations. Most New Zealanders had opposed the war. The gunners went back to their sheep stations and dairy farms and factory jobs, their achievement largely forgotten. But in military circles, the legend grew. U.S. Army artillery schools began teaching Kiwi-style fire control methods. Australian doctrine incorporated lessons learned from working alongside 161 Battery. Even the British Army, which had trained the New Zealanders in the first place, sent observers to learn what their former students had achieved. "They proved something we'd forgotten," said Colonel Wilkins at the Army Artillery School at Fort Sill in 1975. "Technology matters, firepower matters, but precision matters most." The Kiwis won with math, discipline, and an almost fanatical commitment to accuracy. They made artillery relevant again in an age when everyone thought it was obsolete. The Vietnamese perspective was equally telling. In 1985, a former NVA colonel named Nguyen Van Thieu published his memoirs. He devoted an entire chapter to his experiences facing New Zealand artillery. "We learned to fear many things in the war: American bombers, Australian patrols, helicopter gunships. But nothing terrified us like the sound of those 6 New Zealand guns. With bombers, you could hide. With patrols, you could ambush. With the New Zealand guns, you could only pray they were aiming at someone else." Modern conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan saw renewed interest in the Kiwi methods. As Western forces faced urban combat and counterinsurgency operations requiring precision fire, artillery officers rediscovered the lessons from Firebase Coral and Bin Ba. New Zealand artillery teams served in both conflicts, training Allied gunners in techniques their fathers and grandfathers had perfected in Vietnam. The technology has changed: GPS guidance, computer fire control, advanced propellants. But the fundamental principle remains: accuracy beats volume every time. The 30 sheep farmers who picked up artillery in the jungles of Vietnam proved that the most advanced weapon system in any army is still the human brain, properly trained and rigorously disciplined. Captain Maury Stanley, who led 161 Battery through its most intense engagements, summed it up in a 1998 interview. "People always ask how we did it. The secret wasn't complicated. We couldn't afford to miss. We didn't have unlimited ammunition or fancy equipment. Every round we fired had to count because we didn't know if we'd have another one when we needed it. So we made sure every round did count, and after a while, it became habit." Today, at the Royal New Zealand Artillery Museum in Waiouru, 6 L5 pack Howitzers sit in a place of honor. The same guns that fired over 100,000 rounds in Vietnam. Visitors walk past them, often without understanding their significance. They look obsolete, these small mountain guns designed for World War II. They look like museum pieces. But the NVA 165th Regiment could have told you different, if any of them were still alive to tell it.